Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Danny Nobis. I'm the Provost Chancellor for Staff Development and External Relations here at Brunel University. On behalf of the Organising Committee, and indeed on behalf of the Executive, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the first lecture in the 2014 Brunel Public Lecture Series. The Public Lecture Series was originally conceived back in 2008 by our resident what shall I call you, Akram? Quantum physicist, who had this wonderful idea of us organising an annual event whereby people would take their ideas and research into the wider public domain, and indeed, Akram, as always, managed to inspire a small number of people who took it forward. And so over the past 5 years, because this is effectively our sixth edition, we've been able to showcase a great many different people, and I think we've attracted in total about 6,000 people to these public lectures. Now, for this year, we've decided to slightly alter the concept and the format of the series, because I thought public lecture series is a bit like a relationship. If you don't reinvent it on a daily basis, or at least on a regular basis, it becomes a bit repetitive and God forbid, maybe a bit boring. So we tried to change the format and the concept, and we decided to invite some very high-profile external speakers to present their views to us and to engage with us on the general theme of visions of the future. We also decided to allow the public lecture series to run not just in the spring over a period of 3, I think last year was 6 weeks, but to let them run throughout the year. So what we will effectively be giving you is 3 public lectures in the spring and 3 in the autumn. I'd say watch this space or watch the website. More names will be announced, and we guarantee you more high-profile speakers come September. Now, much like in previous years, these lectures will be recorded, they will be edited, and they will be made available via our website, which is brunel.ac.uk/lecture series, which I think you all know about because you've registered for today's lecture. When you go onto that site, you will also be able to see that we have videos of all the previous lectures. Once again, you can contribute to the debate here by posting a message on Facebook. That's facebook.com/Brunel University, or via Twitter using the address @BrunelUni and the hashtag Brunel Lectures 2014. Now, if you haven't seen it already, I'd also like to invite you to the Beldam Gallery, which is on the other side of the central atrium here, where we are currently having an exhibition called Thirst, which is really about showcasing the work of a number of very talented emerging artists. And I have to say, it's very interesting and very impressive what these young people, some of them have only just graduated really, have been able to produce. Now, tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we are incredibly fortunate to have the author of a Bible as our guest speaker. Note that I didn't say the author of the Bible, whose identity will probably remain forever couched in mystery, but the author of a Bible, notably the Good Book, which was published in 2011 and which was given the subtitle A Humanist Bible in the US, and for reasons we may want to explore at some point, the subtitle A Secular Bible when it was published in the UK later that year. Over the past 200 years or so, I really do believe that the place and the function of religion in society, especially in Western society, has changed. As the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor pointed out in A Secular Age, I think that's 2007, there was a time in Western history when it was virtually impossible for people not to be religious, or when they would only be able to express their atheism at the risk of severe punishment. But these days, I think we could say that religion, faith, belief are just one amongst a great many options that humanity is being given. Now, partly, no doubt, on account of the fact that it's become more acceptable than ever before to expose the faults and the fallacies of beliefs, be it religious beliefs, scholars and scientists over the past 10 years or so have been quite vocal exposing religion as an illusion. Maybe it's also partly on account of the fact that the mass mobilization of religious beliefs has often resulted in violence, that we've had these quite vehement critiques of religion. Starting in 2007 with the publication of Richard Dawkins' famous The God Delusion, scholars and scientists over the past 10 years or so have indeed become more vocal about the dangers of religion and haven't hesitated on occasion to designate it as a form of psychopathology, or if not, as a social symptom in its own right. Now, following on from the Good Book, which, as I said, was published in 2011, tonight's guest speaker, ladies and gentlemen, made his own contribution to the God debate. I call it the God debate, right? When in March 2013, roughly a year ago, but it's not his latest book because he's incredibly prolific, he published The God Argument, The Case Against Religion and for Humanism, whose title, I think, in itself indicates sufficiently where our speaker's preference lies and how the Good Book should be employed, not as an alternative religious text, but as a secular source of humanistic wisdom. Now, when A.C. Grayling suggested that he talk about the future of secularism and religion tonight, I was involuntarily, although some people would say it was just my unconscious, reminded of two other good books by the good old Sigmund Freud. Notably, The Future of an Illusion, published in 1927, and Civilization and Its Discontents, published in 1930, in which the so-called father of psychoanalysis was under no illusion that religion was definitely an illusion, but maybe a necessary illusion, or at least an illusion with a future. Insofar as Freud argued it would reduce the constant Weltschmerz, the famous spleen, the mal de siècle, as the French would call it, that we as human beings constantly experience in civilization. A society, of course, that ironically we ourselves created. And to follow Freud, that insofar as religion gives meaning to life, promises a better life, or relieves us of our inner sense of guilt, may indeed have a future. Reflecting upon Freud's words and reading some of our guest speakers' books, I really wondered whether humanism, or indeed any other source of established wisdom, wouldn't essentially fulfill the same role, and therefore equally qualify as an illusion. Or more provocatively, I wondered whether it wouldn't be better or more realistic to accept the meaninglessness, the bleakness and the absurdity of life than to rely on another form of wisdom, religious, spiritual, or humanistic. And I hope that we will be able to discuss some of these questions later tonight. Now, ladies and gentlemen, tonight's guest speaker was until 2011 Professor of Philosophy at Birkbeck College, University of London. He's now the Master of the New College of the Humanities, and he's the author of more than 30 books, the most recent one, which I haven't read, on friendship. I'm very much looking forward to that. He's also a regular contributor to the New Statesman, to the Times Literary Supplement, to the Independent on Sunday and the Observer. His voice can be heard frequently on BBC Radios 3 and 4 and on the World Service, not to mention a great many other channels on radio and TV. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Anthony Grayling.
Thank you very much, thank you. Well, Danny has usurped my opening remarks by challenging me to explain why the subtitles of the American and UK editions of the Good Book are different. It's the result, really, of advice of my American publishers who thought that the word secular would be upsetting to American sensibilities, which you know are very tender, and so they thought that humanist would be a little better. And when I went to the United States on my book tour, because you know how it is, you publish a book there and you travel around talking, usually to rather small audiences in out-of-the-way bookshops. My tour started in Austin, Texas. You might think rather a dramatic place to begin a book tour with a book that doesn't recommend itself to those of faith. Although it is said that Austin is to Texas what California is to the United States, so that gave me some comfort. And my host there was a rather dour gentleman who, when I said to him in the way of jest, I said to him, it would be terribly good publicity for my book if somebody shot me. I mean, missed, of course, that would be a part of the bargain. He said to me, in Texas, assassination attempts are usually successful. So I thought I better leave that one for another part of the US. So that was the reason for the difference in subtitle. But personally, I rather like the subtitle, The Humanist Bible, because when many years ago, more than 30 years ago, I first thought of making such a book. And I thought of it, by the way, because at the time when I was doing graduate studies at Oxford, I was struck by the great difference. There is a very wide difference indeed between ethical outlooks which premise themselves on the idea of a divine revelation or of a metaphysics which includes divine beings in the universe, transcendent beings in some way with an interest in us, and those ethical outlooks that don't, the kinds of ethical outlooks that stem from classical antiquity and the debates that we learn about in the time of Socrates and Aristotle and the post-Aristotelian schools. And the thought passed through my mind that if only the makers of the Bible of religion, who after all were quite numerous, they had taken a number of different texts from different traditions and woven them together. There are at least 4 different sources or authors, for example, of the book of Genesis, one of whom uses a singular, Yahweh, another uses a plural term, Elohim, which means the gods. And these stories, as you know since you were all reading Genesis in the bath last night, you'll remember how often they replicate themselves to at least 2 versions of every major story in Genesis. That if only the makers of this text, the Bible of religion, woven together from so many different sources, if instead they had gone to the philosophers and the historians, the poets and the letter writers, and taken from their non-religious sources texts offering inspiration, insight, wisdom, consolation, commentary on the human condition, without any reference whatever to the commands of deities or to the promise of an afterlife. If instead they had focused just on human realities in this our world, what a different book would have resulted, and perhaps what a different history would have flowed from there being such a book. And then when I had that thought, I thought, somebody ought to do it. And then my next thought was, damn. Well, more than 30 years later, I finally completed the task, and it was a very, very productive one, because as I read and chose and worked on the texts that I'd chosen to put together in this book, so many ideas, many insights were prompted, and lots of other things I wrote came as a result of that endeavour. And I chose to make it rather like the Bible of religion in format, as the Bible of religion does sometimes present itself, like, for example, the King James Bible. In chapter and verse, it's a very accessible format, invites people in who can read short passages, and in particular if there are texts which are inspiring or uplifting or consoling, people can meditate on them. So I used that format too. That was the main reason. But a secondary reason was that the book offers itself as something that could and should stand alongside other works that have the same ambitions or pretensions, and that people could see that here, if one collected together, edited and redacted and paraphrased and wove into a great texture, the insights that our forebears in the human story have offered us, that it might be something of tremendous value. One thing that reviewers complained about, like mad, was that I didn't give any references to the sources of the texts that I used. And there were several reasons for this. One was that not a line in it is untouched by the editorial hand that put them together. Some of the lines were written by the editor himself, so it would have been complicated. Every page would have been studded with superscripts, and the book would have been twice as long with a set of references at the back because so many of the texts are a few lines from here and a few lines from there. But the main reason was, well, very easy to see. Go to the National Gallery or the National Portrait Gallery and watch people as they walk around and notice how much more time they spend reading the little notice at the side of the painting than looking at the painting. Now, what I didn't want people to do was to be chasing up references. I wanted them to read the text and to think about what it said. And that was the main motivation for it. Now, I'm going on far too long about the good book. It is, I think, a good book, not because of anything that I did particularly, but because of the sources from which I drew it. And there is an immense wealth, a great treasury of wonderful insight in our in the story of our civilizations, and I try to draw from those sources, at least some of those sources, and put them together into this book to say, here is another way of portraying our human condition. And it's a matter that interests me very intensely and personally, humanism. I am myself a humanist, even officially. I'm a vice president of the British Humanist Association, for example. But humanism is not a doctrine, it's not a teaching, it's an attitude. It's an attitude that says we should begin our reflection on how to live and how to conduct our relationships with others from our best, our most generous, our most sympathetic understanding of human nature and the human condition. The human condition is something that history and philosophy and literature and psychology explores and examines and debates and illuminates. Human nature, of course, is an even more complicated matter. The great furious discussions of sociobiology and evolutionary psychology, of different philosophical theories about what human beings are, continue with as much ferocity today as they ever have. But our best efforts to understand these things, our most generous and sympathetic attempt to make space for our fellows, their rights, their liberties, their quest to live lives that are good, worthwhile, meaningful for them, is what it is to be a humanist. It is not to cleave to a set of do's and don'ts, but it is a starting point for thinking about how we're to live. And for me, this is important for two great reasons. One is because it's an attempt to answer the Socratic question: what sort of people should we be and how should we live? By what values should we shape and colour our lives? That was the question Socrates asked his fellow Athenians and challenged them to reflect on it, and also to understand that the conventional answers they gave, or the traditional answers, weren't always very satisfactory, or that they didn't really understand the concepts that they used when they thought in those terms. But the other thing is that it was an assumption made by Socrates and by the whole ethical tradition, 2,500 years and more old now, in which humanism consists, that there is not a one-size-fits-all answer to the question, how should we live and what should our values be? But there are as many answers to the question, what makes a life meaningful, as there are people to ask and answer that question. I mean, I'm very often asked by cab drivers here in London what I do. I tell them there's a pause. They're thinking to themselves, what the heck does a philosopher do when he gets up in the morning? I mean, they know what plumbers and doctors do, but do philosophers do this? The answer is yes, by the way, but that's what the cab driver is asking himself. And then they invariably say, well, Governor, what's the meaning of life? And I say to them, I know the answer to that question, much to their surprise. And they say, well, what is it then? And I say, it's what you make it. The meaning of your life is what you make it. And that simple answer is a profoundly deep answer, because it is the answer that has been given by some of the very greatest minds that have addressed it since the time of Socrates. But you notice the importance of that answer. The importance of that answer is each of us has the opportunity to find meaning in life. Indeed, if you think about Socrates' challenge, each of us has the duty to reflect on life. You know, Bertrand Russell said, most people would rather die than think, and most people do. And this is the great tragedy of humankind. But if one accepts the challenge, the invitation, the duty to think about oneself, achieve some degree of self-understanding, and then think about how one can make a contribution, how one can best relate to others, then one is thinking about the individual kind of good life that could be forged by reflective endeavour. And that, as I say, is sharply contrasted to the idea that all ideologies impose on us, whether they are the ideologies of politics or the ideologies of religion, which say there is a great truth, a great right answer, one way in which we achieve salvation, one right route for everybody to follow. And that marks, of course, the division in a debate which, as Danny has pointed out in recent years, has become rather bad-tempered. I think after the atrocities and tragedies of 9/11, as we now call it, there was a great shift, a tectonic shift really, in thinking about the place of religion in society, about the attitude towards people who have a faith commitment by people who don't. It was a very polarizing moment. The gloves came off. Critics of religion have become very outspoken and very frank. A lot of people who have a faith commitment find this abrasive. They sometimes claim to be very affronted. They have to be reminded, I suppose, we sometimes say, those of us on the other side of the argument, that there was a time in the history of these quarrels when those of faith didn't bother to argue with those who didn't have a faith. They just set a match to their toes. And of course, nowadays, the debate, fortunately, takes a rather different complexion. It's one where we can hurl arguments at one another rather than sticks and stones, so we hope. Well, my theme tonight is the future of secularism and religion. And those two terms, secularism and religion, occupy a little family of other terms, and in particular the terms atheism and humanism, which all of which need to be clarified, especially in their relations to one another, because there are important debates associated with each, and the terms don't automatically entail or connect to one another. The word atheism connects with the metaphysical debate about what there is, what exists in the universe or outside the universe or in some way associated with the universe. It's a debate about the kind of realities there are. Those who have a commitment to the idea that there is a deity or there are deities think, therefore, that there are non-natural or supernatural agencies or entities in the universe who are associated with it in some way. This is a metaphysical discussion, and the word atheist is actually a theist's word. It's a word that theists use to describe people who don't agree with them. I personally prefer to be called an atheist. This is because I don't believe that there are fairies in the universe, and I'm fully prepared to have a discussion with anybody about the existence of fairies, evidence for them, the kinds of reasons that one might have for them. And this is not a trivializing remark. You will know, especially historians, social historians among you, that belief in fairies was very, very widespread and common right up until the early years of the 20th century. They curdled the milk, they stole your shoelaces, they caused you ague in the night and so on. There was very widespread belief in fairies. People had this attitude attributed to the elderly Irish lady who was asked if she believed in leprechauns, and she said, "I do not, but they're there anyway." And this generalized attitude was one that was combated, in fact, by the Church of England in the 19th century. One of the motivations for the founding of church schools was, and you may think this an irony, to combat superstition. Well, the claim to be an atheist is one which invites people to shift the debate about the existence of supernatural entities onto a ground where the arguments are a good deal clearer, because there is much less weight of history and of doctrine and of an established church and ancient traditions lying behind the metaphysical issues that are at stake. I also sometimes wish that I could call myself a naturalist, in the sense of somebody who believes that the universe is a realm of natural law. But then, of course, people think you take your clothes off and run around the woods at weekends, so that can be misleading. So perhaps the old-fashioned term free thinker is the most descriptive. Somebody who doesn't have a particular pre-existing childhood indoctrinated or traditionalist view of matters, as sometimes the case with the great religions of the world. So that the atheism-theism debate is a metaphysical debate. Quite differently, the secularism debate is about the place of the religious voice and religious institutions in that part of the public square where public policy matters are debated and decided. Secularism is sometimes described as separation of church and state, but of course It's not just churches, it's also religious bodies and movements or bodies of sentiment. That's why I prefer perhaps the more general term, the religious voice or religious attitude, and what place it should have in the public square. Now, I think a sincere-minded and sober-minded secularist should be a person who says, of course, religious voices have their place in the public conversation. They have a point of view, they have every right to put that point of view. But religious organizations and religious movements are self-interest groups, like trades unions, political parties, and other organizations who want to promote their own view and to influence the general conversation according to that view. But for historical reasons, the religious voice has been given a massively over-amplified place in the public square. Here we are in England, where something like 3% of the population go on a regular weekend basis to a church service. Of course, there are a lot of other people who are C of E in the sense of Christmas and Easter, but that's a slightly different matter. And that body has 26 bishops entitled to sit in the House of Lords. In fact, they don't all sit there at the same time, although some, when they retire, get life peerages and do sit there. There are at least 4 religious programs on the BBC, publicly funded broadcasting service, every day of the week. Senior figures of the Church of England are present at major state occasions. There are prayers said before the sittings of both Houses of Parliament, for example. And this is an organisation whose actual constituency or footprint in active, practising members of the church is very small in our society now, because despite having an established church, we are functionally a secular society. And one might ask whether this has a deleterious effect sometimes on public policy debate. And I know for a fact that it does, because for a number of years now, I've been a patron of Dignity in Dying. It used to be called the Voluntary Euthanasia Society. And we have repeatedly drafted and introduced bills seeking decriminalisation of assisted suicide or legalisation of physician-assisted suicide for people who choose it and who have a settled conscious desire for help to end their lives if their lives are intolerable. And these bills have been blocked on every single occasion in the House of Lords where they've been introduced by Lord Joffe and others, and almost always as a result of the contribution made by representatives of one or another religious attitude in the House of Lords. And this one small example, I could cite others, but for something like a quarter of a century, polling in this country, in England and Wales, has shown more than 80% support in the public for a relaxation of the laws against assisted suicide or against physician-assisted suicide. I should think almost anybody in this room would like a euthanasia, which simply means a good and easeful dying. We would, if we were in a horrible medical condition at the end of life, be very pleased indeed if we could be helped peacefully and painlessly to leave our lives. Most people live far too long, not because they wish to, but because their families want them to. And this right, this entitlement, is one that I think we would all like, even if we never exercised it, given that the vast majority of us would like to squeeze every living moment that we can. So that would just be one example of how the presence of influential bodies, religious bodies, given an inflated influence in the public square, can distort and delay progressive evolutions in our society. One could mention adoption, gay rights, the position of women in society, gay marriage, many, many things over which bitter battles have been fought because of very traditionalist and conservative religious views in our and other societies. So the secular argument is that whereas the religious voice should, of course, be heard in the public arena, nevertheless it should take its place in the queue along with other organizations. If religious bodies were not given the privileged position that they are given, the amplifier, the megaphone that they're given in the public square, if they had to fund themselves from the voluntary subscriptions of their members, if they didn't have charitable status, if they didn't have seats as of right in the House of Parliament, and so on, then the nature of that voice and the degree of its influence would be very different. And that is what the secularist argues. So secularism is quite different from atheism. It's quite natural for atheists to be secularists, but of course there are religious secularists. Indeed, secularism was an invention of the church. Back in medieval times, the church, then the Western Christian church, or indeed Christendom as a whole, was very jealous of its prerogatives, and it didn't want interference from temporal powers, and therefore wanted separation of temporal and ecclesiastical powers. And secularism was therefore an invention of the church. Of course, what it wanted was the state not to interfere with it, but it was very happy to keep interfering with the state. So that asymmetrical relationship remains to this day. So secularism different from atheism. Then the third thing, as I already mentioned, humanism, which is a matter of ethics. It's a matter of how we live, our attitude to life, our approach to it, and the living of it. And the humanist outlook is one which starts from a non-religious basis. That is, it starts from the point of view of trying to understand ourselves and our world, and to think from there towards ways of living, ways of relating to others, which are premised on this existence in this lifetime that we have. Some of you will know, since you would have been reading Herodotus in the bath last night, along with the book of Genesis, what the great lawgiver of Athens, Solon, said to King Croesus of Lydia. When King Croesus, who, remember, was very wealthy, we still say don't be as rich as Croesus, he asked Solon who was the happiest man in the world, and everybody used to say to the king, well, you are, because you're a king and you're so rich. But Solon said, well, I don't know about you, but I do know somebody lived back in the suburbs in Athens. He's the happiest person I knew. Croesus was very angry. What? You choose a commoner over me, he said. Solon said, yes, because I don't know whether you are truly happy. By the way, in those ancient times, happiness was, as Aristotle has it in the concept of eudaimonia, something flourishing and active and something involving movement towards the realization of goals. Today we seem to think that we would all be happy if we had enough Prozac in the public water supply and enough telly to watch. So it was a very different conception they were talking about. But Solon said to Croesus, this business of thinking about happiness is crucial because of the brevity of life. The human life is less than 1,000 months long, if you do the maths. You live to 80, what's 12 times 80? That's less than 1,000. 300 of them you're asleep. Another 300 of them you're in Tesco. So you have 300 months to live with all the vividness and passion that a human life should be full of. Seems rather little. I remember once when I was teaching in Oxford, living in London, I was commuting back to London one night and thinking to myself about this business of the how many months, did a bit of mental arithmetic and thought, oh my God, I'm nearly dead and I haven't read any Smollett. When I got home, I said this to my wife, I'm nearly dead, I haven't read any Smollett. She said, fortunately, we've got some on the bookcase here. That night, I started to read it in the bath, only to toss it out after a few pages, thinking, well, thank heavens I don't have to read that. Next morning, to be told by a colleague, but you must read Smollett, he's wonderful, you've got to keep on. I thought, I've got to read Smollett and I'm nearly dead. Well, the pressure. And this is something that we could all reflect on, the brevity of life and the importance, therefore, of living it to the full, of choosing our values and working towards those goals that give us real meaning in our lives. That was the point that Solon wanted to make then. And it's a point of very vivid interest to the humanist who wants us to make the best of our lives now in the moment and to live them well. And to use those 300 months. That's about 25 years, by the way. It's not so dismal. If you're all doing mental arithmetic at the moment, it's not so bad. But to use those 300 months as well as we can. And that is the great impulse. That humanists believe in the possibility of the good, despite all the trials, difficulties, and dark stretches that afflict us in our lives, but which ask of us that we be good neighbours to our fellows in the human story. So that's humanism. And you can see atheism, secularism and humanism are therefore separable things, even though they do have some natural connections. If you're an atheist, you're quite likely to be a secularist. You're also quite likely to be a humanist. There are religious humanists, of course. It's slightly an oxymoronic notion now because humanism has moved away from religion. No longer do we think as the great Erasmus of Rotterdam did, as a humanist of the Renaissance, but with a sincere religious commitment also. These terms change over time. So those are the important distinctions between those three terms. And the final term in our cluster, the term religion itself. And this is the one which is least easy to explain for the following reason. The etymology of the term is a Latin word, religare, which means to bind. And before the religions of personal relationship, Christianity and perhaps Islam as well, became so dominant and influential in our world because of the globalization of Europe in the last 6 or so centuries. And before that time, religion wasn't anything like the way we think of it now. It was mainly a public affair. There were, of course, the mystery religions, but they introduced this great difficulty that we have in separating the concept of religion from that of superstition. And they are two very different things, because they have two different psychological origins. But religion in the classical world was a public matter, a matter of binding together the community on the premise of the binding vows of the community with its deities, as it were, the larger household gods of the community. And the great public processions and festivals in which citizens took part as a statement of their commitment to the ideal of the community, those religious festivities were the ones that early Christians, for example, refused to take part in, and which made them therefore susceptible to the then filthy name of atheists. They were called atheists because they wouldn't subscribe to the public religion and be part of the communal story. That gives a very different cast to the idea of religion. The idea of superstition is quite a different one. If one may generalize massively, and with great apologies to the Chinese people whom I know well, have written about, lived among, taught and learned from, the Chinese are a very superstitious people, but they are not a religious one. There are no gods in their tradition. No, the concept of Tien, the concept of heaven, is rather like the Stoic concept of the logos, of the order of things. In the case of the Stoics, a rational order. In the case of the Chinese tradition, an established order to which things must conform rightly. If you go back to Confucius and you look at the reason why he thought the rites were so important in the tradition, it was because of the idea of conformity between the universal order and the activities of mankind. But this was not a personal god, it wasn't even a god. And the great atheist traditions of Indian thought, the fact that Buddhism in its original form, and still today in its small vehicle form, Theravada Buddhism, is not a religion, doesn't have a god. The Buddha begged his disciples not to make him one and not to turn his teachings into a religion. These facts are important ones because they ask us to separate movements of thought like Confucianism and Theravada Buddhism and Jainism from religions proper in the now contemporary sense, in which a religion proper is one which premises the existence of a great agency, a supernatural or divine agency with an interest in us and our affairs and our destiny. I've heard it said that the word religion could and should be used for any organized, perhaps rights-bearing or systematic observance. So that, for example, a philosophical outlook could be described as a religion if it organized the thinking and the practice of the individual. But to use the word religion so copiously is to lose an important element of what is distinctive of the world's major religions, and that is the theism associated with it, the commitment of the existence of one or more deities or supernatural agencies. And it's that fact about religion or theistic religion which is very key to the nature of the commitment that people have to it, to the readiness with which people can sacrifice themselves to it or subordinate themselves to it. It's a speaking fact about the moral psychology and the psychology of practice in religion. This idea of submission to the deity and to its commands or desires. In Christianity, we learn that one of the great sins is the sin of pride. Christians pray, not my will be done, but thy will be done. The word Islam means submission. So the idea that to think for oneself, to stand on one's own feet, to be autonomous is somehow lèse-majesté, that it goes against the idea that we are creatures in the true sense of things created, beings created and subordinate. This marks another great difference in the ethical outlook that results from the metaphysics of a religious view, that there is an interested supernatural agency that asks something of us, and those metaphysical views which say the universe is a natural order of natural law, a universe in which we are responsible for thinking about our ethics, about how we live and what our values are. So there I've set out, I hope, the senses that can be attached to those four very important terms: atheism, secularism, humanism, and religion. And now my remarks about the future of two of them. And just before I begin to pontificate on that subject, I just want to remind you that before the First World War, it was noted by aeronautical engineers, a then budding profession, that biplanes flew better than monoplanes. They predicted, therefore, that aeroplanes of the future would have 12 wings. This shows you just how much on a limb one goes out when one makes predictions. So I now make some predictions about the future of secularism and religion. And here there are broadly speaking, two schools of thought. One school of thought notices that the mega churches of the southern states of America and the mega churches of West Africa and the renewed vigor and energy of some evangelical movements around the world, and of Islam, and especially of political Islam, Islamism, of the desire for a return of the caliphate, for sometimes violent activism on the part of people who have a very profound and fundamental commitment to their religion, all seem to mark a recrudescence, a resurgence of religion, of religious commitment and activity. Looks as though religion is coming back. And when people meditate on this and look for possible explanations, one of many that they give is that the sciences have become so remote from the ordinary understanding of people. The scientific view of the world, the quantum mechanical view, the cosmological view, the great detail and nuance and complexity of the biological view are now so remote from the ordinary understanding of the man in the street, if there is such a being, that the natural desire that people have for explanations that are neat and graspable, accessible, and offer closure have become all the more attractive once again. What a religion offers is a neat story, beginning, a middle, and an end, a sense of destiny, an explanation of why things are as they are, where they all came from. They also offer some solace or comfort, perhaps the promise of something after life is over in this dispensation. It has been well said that Bernie Madoff's great mistake was to offer returns in this life. Well, it's not one that's made by most religions. The idea, therefore, is that something comforting, something neat, something explicable, something that can be told more or less in about half an hour, the major doctrines and promises of the major religions, is something that the mind of human beings requires, given the complexity and mystery of life and of the universe surrounding it. It's a speaking fact, the one that I've just mentioned there, that you can explain the major doctrines and promises of any major religion in about half an hour, whereas, of course, it takes years to understand physics and biology properly. And that is why there is this great divide between the kinds of explanations offered or understandings or perspectives that these very different ways of thinking about the universe offer. So this is one reason offered by people who say that the more remote the sciences become, the more complicated life becomes, the more insecure it becomes in certain parts of the world, the more attractive these powerful, solace-giving stories about things become, and that this explains the appearance of resurgence. So that's one kind of view, that secularism is a temporary and now diminishing phenomenon, began with the Enlightenment in Europe, and is being combated now by the return of religion. The other view says that the appearance of resurgence in religion is in fact the turning up of the volume on the part of those people who have a religious commitment and who feel very threatened by the rapidly increasing degree of secularism in our world. This, by the way, happens to be my own analysis. Think of it this way. Think of the pressure on the sensibilities of people in, let us say, a Muslim-majority country who are presented with Hollywood images in film and television, who are appalled by the appearance of laxity, moral laxity in those societies, who fear for the upbringing of their own children. I mean, imagine a father in a Muslim-majority country who sees a movie, Hollywood movie, in which young, attractive ladies run around in bikinis. He has some daughters of his own, and he's very anxious about the effect that this might have on them. And it may not be him, but it may be his son who goes abroad to study in the West, in Germany, let us say, or in America, who is directly confronted by this evidence and finds it very difficult to cope with, very difficult to straddle the two worlds and the ambiguities and complexities that it presents, and who might become angry as a result, feel affronted by it, feel afraid, feel angered by it, and who might therefore take action in response. This would be the result of the greater extension of a secular and pluralistic and diverse culture impinging on a traditional culture and a traditional way of life. Now, if you were to look for evidence for this in the world, if you were to look for numbers, look for sociological data that might support thinking that we're not seeing the resurgence of religion, but we're seeing those who have religion turning the volume of protest up at the world around them, you have only to look at the United States of America, where over the last quarter of a century and more, the Pew Center polling data on religious attitudes has shown a steady decline in religious commitment, especially in people under the age of 35. Something like 8 or 9% of people at the end of the 1970s claimed to have no religion. They're now, by the way, called nuns in the United States. That's N-O-N-E, in plural, nuns. They have no religious commitment. They sign the book, tick the box that says none in the polling data, hence nuns. They were about 8 or 9% at the end of the 70s. They are now approaching 20% at the last Pew data, and approaching something like 30% among under 35s. This is a major change in a country which was founded on religious principles, the principles of religious liberty and identity, and which retains, of course, its reputation as a place where religion flourishes mightily. It's big business in the United States of America, and where there are somewhere in the region, out of a population of about 310 million people, about 60 million evangelicals, who also, of course, are very politically active, usually on the right in politics. The current figures on people who don't have a religious commitment, people who are agnostic or atheist, is about 30 million in that population. So that would be 10%, and then the 20% is made up of people who have moved from Orthodox religion to the what might be called the feng shui tendency, or the there is something accompanied by a shrug tendency, usually en route to a viewpoint which has left those things behind altogether. So if these changes are happening in the United States, it's a kind of augury in a way for what's happening elsewhere. Europe, of course, has for a long time been a pretty secular arena, even though in some countries, in parts of Germany, for example, and in Belgium and elsewhere, Christianity still has an influence. In parts of Europe, Islam is a growing influence as well. But functionally speaking, countries, European countries, tend to be premised largely in their constitutional political practice on a secular outlook. This suggests that the trend begun in the Enlightenment continues, that as societies become more diverse, more educated and wealthier, so they tend to become more secular. People who are afraid of that trend. That is, people who have a faith commitment but are not of the party who say that religion is on its way back, but who say that religion is on the wane, decry these facts. They think that a more secular world is a less moral one, a more violent one, a more difficult one. Well, my friend and colleague Stephen Pinker published about 18 months ago a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he provides a wealth of empirical data that our world, and this is despite the horrors and atrocities of the 20th century and the Great Wars, that our world has been steadily getting more peaceful, that violent deaths in war and civil conflict and interreligious conflict have been declining as percentages of populations. I mean, remember that the world population is expanding very rapidly, but as percentages of these populations, violence and premature death as a result of conflict and internecine struggle and religious differences has been declining over time, from antiquity to the 18th century Enlightenment, at which point the decline became even steeper, and it continues to be that now. Stephen Pinker himself says that there is no guarantee that the decline will continue. There might be an uptick. Things can always go wrong in human affairs. We are fallible and in some sense unpredictable people. But this overarching historical trend is a very significant one. And even if it is a mere correlation and not a causal relationship between the downturn of violence and conflict in our world since the 18th century and the fact of the 18th century Enlightenment, it is still nevertheless a speaking fact that one great rediscovery made by the Enlightenment is of the individual. That is, that the individual is not the possession of an absolute monarch, and the individual is not under the coercive, threat-laden sway to hold a certain view, to subscribe to a set of beliefs, or at least to profess them publicly, but is at liberty to make some important choices for himself or herself. People think that the individualism that stemmed from the Enlightenment is itself a problem because it entails or appears to the destruction of society and social bonds and relationships. But of course, that isn't the case. It isn't even the case in our age of Facebook and Twitter, where relationships seem to take a different cast these days. If you have 500 friends on Facebook, are they really all friends? Is the question you often hear asked now. But the fact is that as essentially social creatures, we human beings need our relationships. At the very idea of a good life is an idea premised on the idea of good relationships. Our memberships of families and communities, of societies, our need to give and to receive love and friendship, our endeavors and their impact on those around us and their impact on us, these are crucial matters. They are matters that occupy us every day, sometimes from moment to moment every day. So the Enlightenment view that we have as individuals responsibilities and rights and opportunities and possibilities that may be very different from those of other individuals does not exclude this central fact about us, that we are essentially social. One quick way of summing all this up, by the way, is just to remind you of what George Bernard Shaw, a great philosopher in his own right, said about the golden rule. You all remember the golden rule? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. George Bernard Shaw said, under no circumstances should you do to other people what you'd like them to do to you, because they may not like it. And this is a very profound insight. But if you think that you should treat other people as you want them to treat you, you're making yourself the benchmark for how everybody else in the world wants to act, or what their interests are, what their desires and aims are. But really, to be a good neighbour to your fellows in the human story, you have to see them in their particularity, in their individuality. They may be very different from you. You may not really understand always their choices and interests. But unless they do harm to you or to others, they have a right to live as they choose. This was the message, you will remember, because you were busy in the bath last night. You were also reading John Stuart Mill on liberty, so you remember what he said, that we must allow people their opportunity to live as they seek to live, providing they do no harm. The great harm principle enunciated by Mill, that you shouldn't interfere with other people's attempt to live a life which is good to live and which has good relationships in it, but allow these diversities to happen, he said, because they all of them constitute explorations in the possibilities of good human lives. And it seems to me that that argument, the argument of the Enlightenment, the argument to which Mill is a contributor, to which Shaw is a contributor, to which the increasing secularizations of advanced societies is itself, that process is itself a contributor, is towards increasing secularism and the diminishing role, not the increasing role, but the diminishing role of religion in the lives of societies. It may not be so readily obvious in the lives of individuals, so there are, again, in absolute terms, many, many more individuals who find that they can live with energy, with vigor, with ambition, with interest in their fellows, with great commitment, and without premising it on the idea that this is what's required of them by the God they worship, or by considerations of reward or punishment in an afterlife, or even in thinking, as some of the best do, that this is a response to the love that the deity has for them, that they should return that love by loving their fellows. But without any of those premises, there are good atheists and good secularists. There are institutions and organizations premised on a secular outlook that do their best in this world. I've seen it myself. I have the great privilege to be a representative of the Human Rights Council in Geneva for the International Humanist and Ethical Union, which labors mightily on behalf of women and children, educational rights and freedom of expression, in the interests of a world where minds are more open, more free, where there is less coercion from ideology, from society, from membership of a traditional group to think one way and no other, and to regard other people as wrong because they don't share that view. And I will end on this thought, that one great reason why I think the future for secularism is rosy and for religion less so curves going in slightly different directions, is the awareness that we at last are able to offer about the very origins of the nature of our psychologies of belief. Here is the story. This is a kind of Nietzschean genealogy, but it's one which is supported by a great deal of evidence that we have from contemporary Stone Age societies and from the mythologies of the world about how religion arose. That it arose among our very earliest ancestors as a kind of proto-science, that is, an attempt to explain the operations of nature in terms of the one thing that our ancestors knew best, which is their own felt capacity as agents. You can pick up a stone and throw it into a pond and make a splash. So you've caused something to happen in the world. Well, if there is thunder and lightning, if the wind blows, if the trees move, if the water flows, surely there must be an agency at work making it happen, causing it to happen. So it's a very natural thing to project the idea of agency into nature. And we see this. In one of the most beautiful mythologies of the world, the Greek mythology, we see the personification of these agencies in the form of the nymphs and dryads in the streams and trees, actually present in nature. There's Zeus thundering as he walks on the clouds and hurling the thunderbolt. Poseidon shaking the earth in the earthquake and making the tides move. Personifications of agencies which, with the stories associated with them, form an elaborate articulation of explanation and to some extent control, because if you can engage with these agencies, if you can propitiate them, if you can sacrifice to them, you may influence their behavior and therefore the way that nature works. You'll notice something, that as understanding of nature increased, so the agencies tended to move away from the trees and streams and up to the mountaintops. Olympus and other sacred mountains. Moses meeting God as a burning bush on a mountaintop. I remember that in Genesis, we're told that God was encountered as a burning bush, as a pillar of smoke by day, perhaps a volcano god is connoted here. But at any rate, mountaintops are very sacred. And when people finally crept to the tops of mountains and found no gods feasting there, where did they go? Well, into the sky. Now that we know that no one way is up, because we live on a sphere, in a universe, they've gone beyond space and time. There's a kind of geography of the gods. They move further and further and further beyond the horizons of our ignorance as knowledge has increased over the many centuries and millennia of belief. And this too is a speaking fact, that whereas once the gods were creatures like ourselves, only with bigger appetites and greater powers. They've now vanished into ineffability. And that's perhaps hardly surprising. My own view is that our early ancestors, with these views about agencies, mistakenly one day ate a magic mushroom or consumed some fermented grain unbeknowingly, or had an epileptic fit or a nightmare, and thought that they had encountered these agencies, that they had broken through the veil separating the agencies from ourselves, and interpreted those experiences as contact with the gods. Secretly, I suspect that it was some bloke, and I'm sure it was a bloke, who thought to himself, if I can persuade my fellow tribesmen that I can talk to these agencies and influence them, then I'm going to get all the money and the girls. And that the temporal powers, when they saw the enormous value that belief has, Plato himself said, hoi polloi, the rabble, should be encouraged in religious belief. It helps us to keep control of them. This idea the temporal powers have that if there is an invisible policeman or set of policemen who see what you do always, even when you're on your own in the dark, this has a great influence over behavior. And it's an interesting fact that in those societies where that view wasn't held, and that may be true of many of our contemporary advanced societies today, what happens is not mayhem. That human beings unaided by traditional beliefs are able to reflect ethically and act ethically on the basis of those reflections. I end with one anecdote. A friend of mine found himself sitting one day next to a Mormon at dinner. This is not very long ago, it was only about 18 months ago. In fact, the friend in question is Felipe Fernandez Armesto, a very earnest Catholic, I might tell you. He found himself sitting next to a Mormon, and he said in his inimitable fashion, with great respect, he said, which is something I don't think I would have said, but he said, with great respect, your religion is a very odd one and a very implausible one. Farmer Smith found the golden plates on his farm in upstate New York in the 1820s. Turned out the angel Moroni appeared and translated it. This is all about how Jesus had come to North America. There's something you would expect to happen, certainly. The Latter-day Saints had this revelation that the angel Moroni was able to tell them about. And Felipe said to this gentleman, he said, it's a very implausible story. And this gentleman, who was hungry and was eating rather busily, and who didn't pause in his eating, said, it won't sound implausible in 1,000 years' time. Well, that has, I think, a message for us when we think about the great swells and transitions of belief systems in our societies, how they become very dominant. After all, think that when the Emperor Constantine said that Christianity is to be regarded as equal with all other religions in the empire, and in less than a century, all the other religions had been banned and Christianity was dominant. And by the time of the high medieval period, the church was everything in society. There was no oxygen for anything else, completely dominant. In the early history of Christianity, apologetics, the apologetics of the church fathers was an important exercise. This was the attempt to explain and persuade. But when you have temporal power, you don't need to persuade and explain because it's illegal not to believe. You just execute if people won't believe. And then that power fades, and over the centuries it has faded increasingly, especially since 17th and 18th century, scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And it is that dynamic of history that I think, and I may be being an optimist here, means that secularism will continue to spread in our world. It may take many decades yet. We may be in for an uncomfortable time as secular forces find their way into societies which still have very deep and sincere traditional commitments. But perhaps in the course of the coming century, if we survive it, we may find ourselves in a world where religion as an organized phenomenon will be much less dominant. It will never cease to be a personal and private phenomenon for many, I suppose. But secularism as a default, I think, and hope, is on the increase. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for a very rich and provocative lecture. You said at the beginning that the good book wasn't very well received. And I read through some.
I didn't say that at all.
I think you mentioned that some people thought that you should have put in the references.
Yes, that's a different matter.
Okay, there was some criticism of it. I actually read through some of the reviews of the good book, and some of them were incredibly critical. And I think you yourself at one point captured the criticism by saying that the reaction had been hysterically hostile, and that left, right, and centre people thought that the good book was actually an incredibly bad book. Now, the same cannot be said for the follow-up, the God argument, which was incredibly well received, even by, I'm looking at the back of the book here. This is a quote from the Church Times, where it says, Professor Grayling himself neatly exemplifies the values of calm rationality which are at the heart of Stoicism and which influenced early Christian thought. Now, there's a bit of a paradox here, because in this book you are much more explicit about the, what should we call the fallacies or the illusions associated with religion. And this book received incredibly good reviews, unlike the good book. Why do you think this discrepancy comes from?
Well, we have to take a couple of steps back and understand that in the UK, literary editors, hope there are not too many of you in the audience here at the moment, are mildly lazy creatures who, when a book of a religious nature comes in, will send it to a religious person to review. Naturally enough, a book which is antagonistic to religion or is non-religious or is known to be written by a person who has that standpoint is going to have an uphill struggle with a reviewer like that. So some of the reviews in Britain were like that. The reviews in the United States were really rather different, surprisingly different, and I would have expected with the different cultural attitudes there that might not have been the case, but in fact that was the case. It even got a jolly good puff on the Colbert Report, so that was something that helped the Amazon figures along. But I suppose really the important thing is what people say when you talk to them at literary festivals or occasions like this, or the letters that you get. I mean, parts of it have been now set to music by a couple of composers and so on. So there was that kind of response to it too, which was very heartening. And from people who were prepared to give it religious people, that is, who were prepared to give it a chance, they would have noticed that there is not one critical word about religion, because the word religion is not mentioned, the word God is not mentioned. There's nothing of a polemical nature about it, whereas this indeed is a much more polemical book.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the good book, when you bring together these fragments from a great variety of different traditions, Western and other traditions, in order to create something that looks like a Bible, because it's composed in chapters and sub-chapters, etc. I think that the first one is even called Genesis, and it moves through a similar structure as the Bible.
It begins with the apple falling in Newton's garden.
Quite, yeah. You nonetheless consistently avoid, for all I can tell, to include fragments from philosophers who, one could deservedly be called religious. Say Martin Buber, I think even Kierkegaard doesn't feature very prominently in the good book. And at that point, your good book differs, I would say, although the concept is also different, from what Alain de Botton has been doing recently in Religion for Atheists. So is it that you don't feel that those religious philosophers actually have important wisdom to offer, or did you have another reason for excluding them from your collection?
I had a criterion of inclusion, which was that the texts in question were not claimed to be religiously inspired. The texts themselves didn't claim to convey the wisdom, the instructions, the insights of a deity, and had nothing to do with promising rewards or punishments in an afterlife. So they addressed specifically the matter of being human in this world, in the presence of a human lifetime. And so quite a few people who were quoted, Newton, for example, I quote, and others, themselves were very religious. After all, Newton spent more time trying to crack what he thought was the numerological code that the Bible, the religious Bible, consisted in, than doing physics and mathematics. So he was certainly religious, but I quote him in it. But not passages which have an explicitly religious purport. So that was my criterion. And for that reason, people who were explicitly religious writers, like Kierkegaard and Buber, I kept out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, in your lecture, you distinguish between secularism, humanism, and atheism. I think it's fair to say that you yourself would position yourself as a humanist philosopher. I found it rather strange to see that in the God argument, you start with a quote from Seneca, which I mean, for me, it's a Stoic, or rather not the most immediately recognizable representative of the humanist tradition. If only because Seneca has clearly also inspired a lot of Christian thinking afterwards. What made you decide to
There's no surprise in that fact, of course. I mean, people must remember that Christianity became dominant over the European mind about 4 centuries, perhaps 5 centuries into the story. And that very early Christians, if you just look, for example, at the documents of the New Testament as chosen by the Church some centuries later, so the 3 Synoptic Gospels and the Johannine Gospel and the letters of St. Paul, and Paul's letters of the earliest documents of Christianity, you see in them a completely unlivable ethic. Mm-hmm. One which says, of course, there are aspects of it which it has in common with all great ethical outlooks. Be kind to the widows and orphans and love your fellow man. Mozi was teaching that 2 centuries before Christ, the Buddha 5 centuries before. But the distinctively Christian teachings are, give away all your possessions. Take no thought for tomorrow. Consider the lilies of the field. They neither spin nor weave. If your family disagree with you, and by the way, if you give you all your money away, they will, turn your back on them. Don't marry. Don't have children, don't marry unless you're about to burst into flames. Now this is the instructions on life for people who very, very sincerely believe they lived at the end of time. Mm-hmm. Of course you don't need money or make plans or marry or think about tomorrow if the Messiah is going to return next week or next month. And they sincerely believed this. This was really central to their early existence. But when the centuries passed and they were looking at their sundials and the Messiah hadn't come back, they needed more stuff. They needed more ethics, certainly, and they needed more metaphysics. They got their metaphysics from Plotinus. St. Paul had taught that he was a Jew, and he taught that when you die, like the Jews thought, your body went into the ground, and when the trump sounded, the graves would open, and out you would come. St. Paul says with the new body, this is the one bit of St. Paul I like, because I want a 6-pack and a tan, when I come out of the grave. And he said the saints won't corrupt, that means they won't rot in the grave. But when 4 centuries later they were starting to move the saints into the churches for relics, they found they had rotted. So they needed a different story. It wasn't that they weren't saints, like Zosima and the brothers Karamazov, but that their immortal souls had gone to heaven. Now, where did the teaching of the immortal soul come from? From Plato, from Platonism. Right. Sure. Where did the ethics come from? You're dead right, from Seneca and the Stoics and other people. Because Christian ethical teaching was so thin, it needed to import quite a lot of the thinking of the traditions before its time. Don't forget that the humanism of the Greek philosophical schools predate the dominance of Christianity in Europe by 1,000 years, or nearly, from the time of Socrates to the time that the Church became the sole religion of the empire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, you stated in your lecture that humanism is an attitude. Is it something we can learn? How does one acquire the values of humanism?
Well, one can be encouraged to it. One can be given the reasons why it's an attitude profoundly well worth having. I described it as an attitude of sympathy and generosity to other people. If one pieces together many of the humanistic insights, like the one I quote from George Bernard Shaw, for example, like the idea that there are many different ways in which people can make their lives good to live and good in their impact on other people. Remember that the oracle at Delphi had over the entranceway the adjuration to know yourself. Know thyself was the Delphic injunction. And this is the importance of this is that when one has some degree of self-awareness or self-understanding, which is the great achievement of analysis, for example, or of an education in which one plunges one's hands and mind into the conversation that mankind has had with itself, that humankind has had with itself in literature and history and philosophy. the self-understanding that one might achieve, and it might be the work of a lifetime to achieve it, nevertheless, helps one to see how one might live and how one might engage with others. That there would be many, many different ways of doing this. And this is the great beauty of it. Because of the variety and diversity of human nature and human possibility, one wants to allow that. One wants people to be free to do this. This is why inculcating religious orthodoxies into small children seems to me a wicked thing to do, because it closes down for them or makes it very difficult for them when they start to try to think for themselves later about how they might do this, how they might achieve that degree of flexibility and freedom of mind which will allow them to apply their self-awareness to the projects that might make life good for them. And there will be many, many such projects. This is why, by the way, freedom from religious coercion or religious proselytization, the freedom of children from religious indoctrination, are human rights issues, in my view.
I mean, at that point, I was very moved by what you said about your position with reference to assisted dying. Clearly, you're not just a humanist, you're also a philosopher. And you're a philosopher who is recognized as a public intellectual and someone who participates in a great many different debates. Do you believe it's important for a philosopher to occupy that role? And when you do you really believe that philosophy can, to quote Boetius, can bring consolation?
Oh, philosophy certainly can, but I don't think that it's the role of the philosopher to pontificate and tell people what to think and how to live. Rather, everybody should recognize that they are philosophers. Everybody in this room is a philosopher. Everybody in this room has discussed in the pub the rights and wrongs of abortion and how they should vote and what they should think about life and whether there is a God. Everybody will have the experience of how much cleverer they get as the evening goes by and how more right they become. But those discussions are philosophical discussions. And it's actually the idea that philosophy belongs to everybody, that everybody should be reading the philosophers, that this debate that we've had with ourselves as a species is something that everybody should participate in, was once an assumption. I mean, David Hume and René Descartes and Aristotle, it didn't write for professionals, sure, other professors of philosophy. I mean, I've been as guilty as any of my colleagues in contemporary and recent philosophy, which is now a new scholasticism, a new technical discipline. You have to have a very, very long training in it to be able to understand all those long words like marmalade and corrugated iron, which these books are full of. And I've been guilty of that, and I'm sorry that I have been. But these great figures in the tradition wrote for their educated fellows, that it was part of the debate. And anybody with any degree of self-respect would want to know about it and be party to it. So it's not that a philosopher should be teaching his fellows what to do and think, but that is that everybody should be a philosopher and everybody should be thinking. This is the force of the remark I quoted from Russell. So many people, too many people, try to escape the responsibility of thought. They want other people to have done their thinking for them. They want other people to have decided what's right and wrong and how we should live. And it's quite hard to work it out for yourself, that's for sure. When I described Socrates' challenge, he wanted to sting people into realizing that when they talked about courage and confidence and goodness and rightness and justice, they didn't always know what they were talking about. I mean, it's a classic example, those of you, when you hasten home this evening and take down a copy of the Meno by Plato and read this wonderful illustration of how Socrates did his work. Meno, rich young man on a business visit to Athens. And in those days, no TV or bingo in the evening, so he went to discuss with Socrates a burning issue of the day, which was, is virtue teachable? This was because the teenage children of the citizens of Thebes and Athens and Corinth, drinking too much ouzo, staying out late at night, getting pregnant, stealing chariots. I mean, we can thank heavens we don't live in those ancient times. And they all wanted to know why the upstanding citizens couldn't pass their virtue on to their teenage children. And Socrates said, I don't know. And Meno was absolutely amazed. What? Why don't you know? And Socrates said, because I don't know what virtue is. And Meno said, but are you really Socrates? How can you not know what virtue is? Socrates said, well, I don't. Do you? Meno said, of course I do. Socrates said, thank God, I've been looking for somebody all my life. Well, you can see what happened next. I mean, every effort that Meno made to try and define virtue was completely demolished by Socrates, who said, when Meno said to him, Socrates, you're like a stingray, you've stung my lips and tongue, I don't know what to say. Socrates said, good, and now that you know that you don't know what you're talking about, we can begin to make progress. And that was his main, confusion is the beginning of wisdom. This is the great moral. And we wanted to show that people were confused about what they thought, and they really had to get down to thinking about it. But of course, most people go to the frozen food warehouse of ideas, take out a frozen pizza. I remember Bridget Keenan once saying that she saw a menu in a Kazakhstan restaurant which said pizza with complications. Well, this is what people want. Take the pizza out of and eat it because somebody else has cooked it. Somebody else has come up with the ideas, and it just explains everything for you, and you don't do it yourself.
Well, the great irony of the Meno is that on the one hand, Socrates doesn't claim that he knows what virtue is, but on the other hand, in the process of extracting the knowledge from Meno, he shows what the virtue is of this epistemic obstetrics or whatever you're going to call it, right? Because he extracts,
yes,
exactly. Yeah. I think at that point we can open it up to the audience. We have a good 25 minutes. Any questions? I'll take a first question here.
Thank you for what is ultimately a very optimistic view for secularism. For those of us who are humanist secularists, but after we put I guess what comes next is assuming that we manage to put away the memic pathogen of religion. What would come next?
I think the debate, I described it as a bad-tempered quarrel at the moment between those who have and those who don't have religion. I'm very proud to call Richard Dawkins and the late, much lamented Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Dan Dennett, people like that, as friends, as personal friends. And I know that some people think that Richard Dawkins is sometimes quite rebarbative in his criticisms of religion and attacks on religious people, although you couldn't find a nicer, more mild-mannered man. And if you look at him on YouTube, you see that that's the case. But he does sometimes not pull punches, and he does sometimes speak very bluntly. And people do find that, claim to find that offensive. As I said, the offence committed by theists in the past was of a different order. But all that said, one important outcome of the last decade, let us say, of debate between religionists and anti-religionists is this question of if you get rid of religion and if religion is no longer the underpinning of people's lives and doesn't give them the framework by which they live and think, what is there? The answer is philosophy. The answer is humanism. And the point about humanism in particular is that it is not only does it have its roots in these very ancient traditions of thought that have survived and been contributed to continually in all the centuries since, right up to our own day, but it is a very rich and a very humane outlook. It's a very sympathetic outlook. It's one which says that it recognizes and accepts that life can be difficult and sad. I mean, for example, just to give you one example, to fall in love with somebody and to be loved in return is to enter a contract for sorrow, because one of you will die first, or in the natural course of events, maybe love will be lost and things will change. But the supreme value of loving and being loved is such that nobody, even knowing, even accepting this, the shadow side of this contract, would not want to experience it or to be in love or to hope to try to love well and to keep love alive forever. And sometimes, of course, that happens, and it happens wonderfully. Well, that is the kind of thing which, just addressing the natural human phenomenon of the connections that we make with one another and our need to be connected in that way, and to reflect on all the implications of it. That is a subject matter which the poets and the prophets and people of religion and others have spoken about and made contributions to, but which, just taken by itself in the terms that I've just described it now, is of its essence a humanistic principle. And it's that kind of thing that one wants to alert people to and say to them, there is this tradition, there are these other people, there is this conversation that can be had about the value of life, of living, of being in this world, and of making the best of oneself and of things in this world. which has this amazing resource, this amazing literature behind it, this amazing history. And people are not aware of it because, and I have to say, the churches themselves have marginalized philosophy and have silenced the humanistic voice to some extent unless it serves their purposes. And that's a pity. And here is something, by the way, that every human individual on the planet could sign up for. If we all, by a wave of a magic wand, became humanists around the world, 75% of the reason that we have for killing one another and being unfriendly towards one another would vanish.
So I'm a little bit pessimistic in the sense that, assuming we do overcome the religious psychopathology, I just think something else might come and take its place, like Marxism.
Well, Marxism, I suppose, in its political applications, shares, perhaps too far, the lineaments of ideology in general. I mean, I described major religious outlooks as, in fact, sharing with major political ideologies this commitment to the idea of the one-size-fits-all model, and that if people don't conform to that model, they can be in big trouble. This happened with Stalinism, it happened with Torquemada's Inquisition, it happens everywhere that theocracy or a single-party state outlook prevails. So the idea of civil liberties, of human rights, of diversity and plurality in society, those sorts of small L liberal conceptions which are associated with Enlightenment thought are, of course, the counter to any kind of monolithic ideology that wants to impose a single overarching structure on us, and in particular on our minds. So that's where our hopes have to lie, that we can keep people different from one another in the relevant respects and recognizing our commonalities in the other relevant respects.
Thank you.
I'll take a question up there and then I'll come to you.
Good evening. Professor, how do you see the future of secularism in the Muslim world, especially after the Arab Spring, for example, countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and currently Syria, which Bashar al-Assad himself is a secularist, and the masses are struggling to remove that. Can I just point out something? The people of Syria wants Bashar to be removed. And there are reasons for it, because secularism was not part of history in Syria. Islam was part of their history, and a lot of the masses today in the streets and a lot of the rebels want Islam to be implemented on them and not secularism. So what's your view on that?
Well, it's a complicated and tragic matter. One thing that one notices in connection with the revolution in Egypt is that secular, liberal, educated elites who tend to be the vanguard of revolutions never inherit them. They make them, but the revolution is taken over by other more populist groups with very different agendas, and that seemed to be what happened in Egypt until the army stepped in yet again because it wanted to impose its own version of a secular solution to the difficulties there. The secularizing agenda of Iraq and Syria in the last half century or more since the revolutions in those countries has inflamed rather than solved problems about intercommunal tensions. Of course, the worst aspect of the tragedy in the Muslim world at the moment is that most violence in the Muslim world is Muslim-on-Muslim violence. And some analysts in the West now, perhaps wrongly, I don't know, but a theme is emerging that what's happening in Syria is a proxy war between the Sunnis of Saudi Arabia and the Shiites of Iran, and that the growing center of conflict is an intersectarian conflict within Islam itself. So I don't know whether this is true or not, but this, as an outside observer of the circumstances, is one of the themes that seems to be emerging. It may very well be that the internal dissensions and tensions that are being experienced in the Muslim world itself are one result of, or contribution to it is being made by the increasing secularism elsewhere in the world and the pressure of that on traditional sensibilities. In the course of my talk, I gave as an example how this might work, how people might be made very anxious in a traditional religious community by feeling besieged in a world where those sorts of values are no longer respected or adhered to. And when that does happen, there is a period of turmoil. I talked of the volume going up, of anxiety increasing, of perhaps the next few decades or this century being a very difficult time, a sort of bottleneck time, as these things work themselves out and as the new, increasingly secular dispensation takes hold. Some people here might be alive when it's over. Some of us won't be. Some of us, tragically, may not be because of it.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Grayling, for a very interesting lecture. My name is Maria Galina. I'm a former student of Brunel. I recently turned towards spiritualism. Two questions. First of all, can you explain to me or give me what is the difference between humanism and spiritualism? Because a lot of things that you said seemed similar to what spiritualism is all about. Perhaps you could define that. Secondly, one comment, you mentioned that secularism will continue into society in the future. Unless I've missed something, I've not heard you mention anything about the age of Aquarius, which we are supposed to be moving into or are already on the cusp of the age of Aquarius, which is supposed to bring about a greater caring and loving society. So if you could explain that, please.
Well, one strong implication of what my friend Steven Pinker says in his book, which I quoted, is that whether or not one believes in ideas like the Age of Aquarius, we do seem to be on a trajectory which is moving us towards greater peace within and between societies. I very much hope that that continues to be the case, obviously. One thing one notices is that in times of turmoil and conflict, technological advance speeds up tremendously, but the arts, literature, education, progress in so many other respects tend to be the fruits of times of peace, when people can reflect and converse with one another and exchange ideas. And so one has high hopes, really, that if it were true that we were moving towards a more peaceful world, despite all the tragic things that are happening in our world now, then those fruits will become more abundant. So that idea, whether one puts it into symbolic terms as a movement towards the Age of Aquarius or we're in it already, it may empirically be the case that we're heading that way. I'm not myself sufficiently clear about what's meant by spiritualism. To answer you, my association with the term is that, sort of possibilities of communication with the dead and the like. I'm myself of the metaphysical view that there aren't non-material entities in our world, or spirits or ghosts. I did once find myself staying in a 15th century coaching inn on my own, where the book on the bar in the public area of this inn had a very detailed account from the British Psychical Society of all the ghosts in the different rooms. And I'd said to the landlord of this pub, who didn't live in the pub, he was some way away, "Anybody else staying here tonight?" He said, "Nope, you've got the place to yourself." So I thought, I'm going to be jolly cross if a ghost does turn up, because it's going to mean a complete revision of my metaphysical outlook. And I have to tell you that none did turn up. But that one little anecdote says nothing either way.
Unfortunately, I have to move on because there's quite a few other questions waiting and time is short. Neil.
I'm just slightly intrigued by the way that humanist has undergone a kind of conceptual modification, because, Erasmus would have called himself a humanist, and yet he remained, although fiercely critical of the papacy, he remained a loyal Catholic. He dissented from Luther's position, he stuck with it. And again, the concerted attempts that followed throughout the Renaissance and into neo-Stoicism, this sort of Belgian attempt, Justus Lipsius, Philip Rubens, the brother of the more famous Peter Paul. I mean, these quite concerted attempts by Catholic Christians to reconcile the insights of classical antiquity with their faith continued. And it strikes me that what's missing in terms of debate in the last 30, 40 years is that province in certainly Catholic theology, which used to be called natural theology, i.e. according to people who use their reason correctly, the attainment of the cardinal virtues, faith, prudence, prudence, temperance, justice and fortitude, has completely disappeared. And now there is no middle ground. Between faith and non-faith, there is no middle. It's become completely ambivalent. And I wonder if that's actually what's made the debate that much more intelligent. And also that, in a sense, this kind of strand in European thought, I suppose, begins with, I think, Euthyphro of Darwin and Plato, and is crystallised in Kant's autonomic and heteronomic codes of moral conduct. You know, autonomic involving your own kind of self-legislation, heteronomic involving the avoidance of external sanctions. That obviously was able to be propounded in those centuries, but now religious bodies see that very much as a threat. And I'm wondering if, in fact, this debate has been made much more fierce by the fact that religious apologists can't quite accommodate ground which their forefathers in previous centuries would have done.
Well, you pack a lot into that question. My answer to the very last of the points that you make is yes. To the very first of them, the point about the concept of humanism and its place in the Renaissance, where indeed the phrase religious humanism would not be an oxymoron, is correct. I mean, it was really very much the hope, the aim of a number of Renaissance humanists to reconcile the attitude of the attitudes discoverable in the writings, the rediscovered writings of classical antiquity with Catholic orthodoxy or church orthodoxy. That's true. But the sense in which that outlook, the antique outlook, and church teaching are incommensurable or at odds with one another, grew and grew, so that the adjective finally dropped away. Religious humanism and humanism came to be associated with the secular outlook. In a way, had there been a sort of William Hazlitt figure around in the 14th or 15th century, that is, somebody with the clear-sightedness and prescience to see which of the two elements here married in the concept of religious humanism would survive, would probably have noticed something very speaking about the contrast between the Renaissance and the immediately preceding high medieval period, when the church was so dominant. A great deal of the literature and almost all of the art of the high medieval period was devotional. The literature was very often of the contemptus mundi form. This world is a vale of tears. We just managed to hang in there and survive. We'll get into our posthumous felicity if we don't sin too much. And the art of the period is focused on the great moments in the Christian story, on the Virgin herself, and so on. Compare that to Renaissance art and literature, to the poetry, the music, the paintings. Paintings of landscapes and picnics, portraits of ordinary people, the turning of attention, that is, to this world, because the recovered attitudes of classical antiquity, which celebrate the possibilities of life in this world and the good things of this world, stand in a very, very sharp 90-degree stance towards the prevailing attitude of the Gothic imagination. And humanism has its birth and its life in the latter attitude, not in the earlier attitude. And that is why ultimately the two attitudes turned out to be inconsistent. And that is why now, although I'm sure there are still people who would regard themselves as religious humanists, and I really, really like to understand quite what they mean by that, given the fact that the focus of the humanist attitude is making the best of this life in this world, making the best of those 1,000 months. And that the fact of death, the fact of the end to our consciousness, or the end of the existence of people we care about, is a very important ethical fact. It's a fact that gives shape and part of the meaning to the endeavours, to our endeavours in this time that we have.
I'll take 2 more questions. Justin, I think you were first.
Thank you. You mentioned those who take offence at some of the ideas that you put forward. And I wonder if philosophy and science has in fact a duty to offend.
Well, that's a very good question. I think sometimes any system of thought does. And claiming to be offended should never be an answer to being offended. And a slightly sort of tangential point is that we have in our legal system today the criminalization of attacks on people because of their religious affiliation. Now, if you think about outlawing attacks on people or discrimination against people because of their age or their disability or their sex or their sexuality, you see the point. But religion is something which, even though it's very difficult to get rid of it or may involve complications to choose it, is a matter of choice, ultimately, rather as your political stance is, and therefore ought to be as subject as your political stance to ridicule or criticism or offensive remarks. The offence sometimes given by science is of the kind that Darwin's theories gave to his contemporaries and successors, the realization that we are kin to the rest of nature and that we are primates, or that cosmology gives to people who think that this planet is at the centre of the universe and the centre of universal attention. It's a horrible blow to human egoism to find that we're on a modest rock around a modest sun in a little corner of just one galaxy among trillions. So these are very offensive things, and it may very well be the truth when it is clear and when it is spoken is going to upset somebody. Let it.
I'll take one more question, but I have at least 4 hands, so
the power.
I think you were first in the blue T-shirt. And my apologies to all the other people.
Thank you. Just as a background, I'm a physicist and a Christian, which is where I'm coming from. Hi. One thing that I'm struggling to reconcile with your position is the freedom of choice for all individuals with some things you were talking about as human rights, such as you were talking about euthanasia as an example and indoctrination of children religiously. And I think that those kind of things are going to have different opinions based on people's metaphysical point of views, religious point of views. And how does humanism reconcile the freedom of everyone to choose their own paths for meaning, and yet still assert that certain things are basic human rights? Does that make sense?
Yes, it's an interesting question. The way in which what we share with one another as human beings, our commonalities and our shared interests, and the diversity that there is among people, different interests and tastes and hopes and objectives. These two things are intensely subjects of conversation between us all the time. They are the very matter of our personal relationships and of our political conversations. One objective or objectivizing basis that we have for thinking ethically about our general responsibilities to others comes from rather simple general facts about us. For example, most of us don't like to be cold or hungry or in pain or locked up in a cage or maltreated or prevented from being able to form relationships with others. So these are very, very general facts that tell us something about how we might behave towards our fellows. Not just because we wouldn't like to be treated in those ways ourselves, although that does figure in it. It figures in it in giving us some sympathetic understanding of how it might be for others, but because we have a provably natural impulse towards our fellows in the human story, given these natural biological facts about us and our kinships. I can prove it very easily in the following way. Supposing you see somebody standing next to a wall, on top of which there's a teetering pile of bricks, and you see that something happening on the other side of the wall is about to tip that pile of bricks onto that person's head. What would you do? Now, I think independently of who that person is, what religious symbols they wear, what ethnicity, what gender, I think anybody, almost anybody, would cry out a warning as soon as they saw the danger. Of course, there might be a slight doubt about it in this iPhone camera age, and somebody might think, oh, this is going to be interesting. So maybe that's making a moral change. I don't know. But generally speaking, people would instinctively call out a warning to another human being. And I put that fact alongside the following. Our newspapers are full of war, strife, conflict, murder, mayhem, atrocity. Full of the terrible things that are happening in the Middle East today, for example. Why? Why are our newspapers full of them? The answer is because they're news. That the majority story about human interaction, in every city, town, village, everywhere in the world, every minute of every day, is ordinary courtesy, kindness, cooperation, people getting on together. You only have to look around a town or a city to see the fruits of cooperation. Buildings and streets and buses, generally speaking, running on time, water supply, electricity, and so forth. The majority story about human beings is sociality, the togetherness and cooperation between us. Minority story is the story that fills our newspapers. And those stories upset us because, generally speaking, we don't like to think of children going hungry or people being bombed or turmoil, impoverishment, lack of any ordinary human living chance for people. Now, these are important facts about our commonalities. But it's also an important fact about us that we are different. Remember the life of Brian? Where Brian tells the assembled mob, we're all different. And one person says, I'm not. Well, this is an example of how we can reach out to the pluralism of human reality and recognize that, not everybody's hobbies here will be other people's hobbies, not everybody's tastes or sexuality or interests or aims, ambitions, hopes will be the same. And that is where the demand on us to respect the other, to respect the autonomy of the other, providing we all observe the harm principle as far as we can, and to do it sincerely. And it's very easy to say, well, I'm doing my best, but couldn't help murdering that person, but anyway, I was doing my best. You can't get away with that. But the idea of a sincere or authentic endeavour to do one's best in that respect is what we can ask of each other, legitimately.
I feel that the discussion could go on for at least another half hour or so, yet unfortunately we need to draw the evening to a close. Thank you all for your contributions. Please join us on the 10th of March for another talk as part of this series by David Willits on the future of higher education. And then the third one for the spring part will be on the 7th of April. That's when we have Lord Winston talking rather mysteriously about meddling with the future. You do have to register because this auditorium does only take 380 people, and we want to make sure that we can keep an eye on the numbers, but I do hope that you can join us there. It leaves me to thank Professor Grayling for an absolutely magnificent lecture, so please join me in